I used to think I knew my older brother, Ethan, like the back of my own hand. We'd grown up under the same leaky roof, passed the same mugs back and forth at breakfast, argued over the same remote on the same worn-out couch. I thought I knew his moods, his jokes, the way he filled a room. Then one ordinary night, I heard his voice behind a half-closed bedroom door, talking in a way I'd never heard him talk before. What I discovered wasn't explosive or scandalous. No secret affair, no double life. But it quietly rearranged everything I thought I understood about him, and about myself. Before I begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Are you listening from a busy city or some sleepy little town where the streetlights buzz and the nights are long? I like to imagine you there, in your own familiar place, while I share a story that begins in a very ordinary house on a very uneventful evening, and somehow opens a door I never saw coming. My name is Hannah. I'm 18 now, but back when this happened, I still felt caught between who I'd been as a kid and whoever I was supposed to grow into next. Our house sat in a quiet subdivision just far enough from the main road that, on still nights, you heard leaves rustling before you heard cars. The kind of neighborhood where porch lights glowed a soft amber instead of that harsh blue, white you see in parking lots. It was the kind of place that didn't make your heart race. At least, that's what I thought. It was late afternoon. The kind of light where the sun hasn't quite made up its mind to set, but the shadows are already stretching their arms across the lawn. I'd just finished my homework, which really meant I'd stared at the last algebra problem until the numbers turned into a blur. That's when I heard his voice. It drifted down the hallway from his room. At first, it barely registered. Ethan talked on the phone all the time. He was 21, he had a job, he had friends I'd never met, and somehow, he always made it sound easy. He carried himself like someone who'd already figured out where he was going, while I still checked my reflection for signs of who I might become. But as I walked past his door on my way to the kitchen, something stopped me. His voice was different. It was softer, slower. Not the playful tone he used when he was roasting his friends or making fun of our dad's music playlists. There was none of that careless laughter. It was the voice people use when they've peeled back a layer and are finally telling the truth. The door was mostly closed. Not fully shut, not wide open. That in-between kind of close that says, I want privacy, but not, don't you dare come near. A stripe of warm light spilled onto the hallway carpet from the gap. Yeah, I know I'm trying. I heard him say low and earnest. It's just a lot right now. Something in my chest tightened. Maybe because Ethan never said things like that out loud. In our family, he was the rock, the one who checked the tire pressure in Mom's car, the one who teased me about losing my phone charger again, while secretly finding it for me, the stable one. Hearing him sound uncertain felt like watching the sun flicker. My hand rested against the wall. I froze there, listening, even though every decent instinct told me to move along. A second voice answered, muffled through the door. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone, calm, steady, not sharp like our dad's when he was stressed, not soft like Mom's when she worried, and not from his usual circle of friends. It sounded older, more measured. I felt curiosity flare up like a match. Who was he talking to? It wasn't about being a nosy little sister pressing her ear to the door. That wasn't it. Or at least it wasn't all of it. It was the way his voice held things I'd never heard before. Hesitation, strain, a quiet kind of honesty. That's what rooted me there for those extra few seconds. I took a careful step back before the light under the door could catch my shadow and forced myself down the hallway. The kitchen, when I got there, sounded too quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped its familiar, lazy rhythm. The window over the sink reflected an orange stripe of sky. Even the old floorboards seemed to hold their squeaks, like they knew something fragile was happening in the house. I pulled the fridge open and stared into it without really seeing anything. I wasn't sure why that overheard sentence had set something off inside me. Maybe it was because I'd built my brother up into this myth in my head. The unshakable one, the problem solver, the guy who didn't need anyone. Hearing him sound human, hurting even a little, made me realize there were whole continents of his life I knew nothing about. A few minutes later, Ethan came into the kitchen. The air shifted. He moved a little slower than usual, one hand scraping back through his dark hair in that way he always did when his thoughts were somewhere he didn't quite want to look at. He took a glass down from the cabinet, filled it at the tap, eyes distant. He saw me then, and his face did that thing it always does when he sees me, softens, warms. But behind that warmth there was a shade of something else. Tired. Heavy. "You okay?" I asked, like I was asking about the weather. He hesitated. Not for long, but long enough that I knew my question hit somewhere real. "Yeah," he said, slipping on his easy smile. "Just thinking." Thinking. That was his favorite shield. I didn't push. With Ethan, you don't dig with questions. You wait for him to hand you whatever he's willing to share. But for the first time, I felt something stir in me, not just curiosity, but the beginning of a new kind of concern. For years, I'd leaned on him without ever wondering what it cost him. And now, hearing that voice from behind his door, seeing that quiet strain around his eyes, I realized he was carrying things I'd never even noticed. And that realization was just the beginning. The next morning, the house felt off. Not noisier, not quieter, just different. Like when you walk into a room and can't quite place what's been moved. Maybe it was because I'd fallen asleep thinking about his conversation, replaying that one sentence over and over. It's just a lot right now. And even after a full night's sleep, the memory clung to me, like the smell of rain on pavement after a storm moves on. I got dressed, brushed my hair into the same ponytail as always, pulled on jeans and a t-shirt. But all through my morning routine, there was this awareness under my ribs that something important was happening just out of sight. Downstairs, the scent of toast and coffee wrapped around me as I walked into the kitchen. Ethan was already there, leaning against the counter, a mug in both hands. He was staring out the window, as if the patchy grass and cracked birdbath out back held answers. His shoulders were a little hunched, not in defeat, but in thought. "Morning," I said softly so I wouldn't startle him. He turned and gave me that half smile again. Familiar, but somehow more fragile at the edges. "Hey, Han. Sleep all right?" I nodded and reached for a bowl. The clatter of cereal against ceramic punctured the silence. I glanced over at him as the flakes fell, noticing small things, the steam curling up from his mug, the way his fingers tapped absently against the ceramic, the small crease dug between his eyebrows. "Did you stay up late?" I asked lightly. He blinked, snapped slightly out of his fog. "Yeah," he said after a beat. "Just talking." He left it at that. I let it rest. But there was something new between us now. A thin line of knowledge. That he wasn't as unbreakable as I'd always assumed, and that he had chosen, at least with someone, to stop pretending he was. He finished his coffee and grabbed his keys. At the doorway, he paused, one hand on the frame. "Hey," he said, turning back. "Yeah. If I ever seem off," he said slowly, choosing each word. "It's not you. Okay, just stuff I'm working through." His voice wasn't shaking, but it wasn't perfectly calm either. It was honest in a way that made my chest warm and ache all at once. "Okay," I said. "And you know you don't have to do all that alone, right?" His eyes softened. For just a moment, I saw something open there. Not weakness, just truth. "I know," he said. "Thanks." He left, the door clicking softly behind him. The house felt ordinary again, but I wasn't the same. That afternoon, after school, I found myself wandering down the hallway toward his room. I wasn't snooping for secrets. I was following that tug inside me that just wanted to understand him better. His door was open now. Sunlight spilled across his bedspread and splashed on the messy stack of papers on his desk. Normally, I'd never set so much as a toe inside his room without knocking. But the open door felt like an invitation, or at least not a clear, keep out. I stepped to the threshold and paused. No voices, no low murmur of that other person on the line, just quiet. Inside, his room smelled like detergent, old paper, and the faint spice of the aftershave he used sometimes. The wooden shelves he and Dad had built years ago held books, trophies, a dented baseball. On his desk sat a small spiral notebook, its cover soft and frayed from too much use. Something in me leaned toward it. Another part of me pulled back. Before I could decide which one, I heard the front door open. "Hannah?" Ethan called. My heart jumped. I stepped back from the desk, out into the hallway. He rounded the corner a second later, surprise flickering across his face before easing into curiosity. "What are you doing?" he asked. Not accusingly, just wondering. "Nothing," I blurted, then winced at how guilty that sounded. "Just walking around." He studied my face, then tilted his head toward the back of the house. "Come outside," he said. "There's something I want to show you." The way he said it, not heavy, not cryptic, but important, sent a small pulse of anticipation through me. He led the way through the kitchen and out the back door. The grass still held little beads of water from an earlier drizzle. They caught the light like tiny pieces of glass. I could smell something sweet on the breeze. Honeysuckle from the neighbor's fence, maybe. He didn't talk at first, just walked slowly along the fence line past the old shed to a spot I'd never really paid attention to. There, tucked between a scraggly lilac bush and the fence, was a small clearing. Nothing fancy. Just a worn bit of ground where the grass grew a little shorter and the noise of the street seemed to fade. "This is where I come when my head gets loud," he said quietly. "Helps to be somewhere that doesn't expect anything from me." We both stepped into the space. It did feel different somehow, more private than the rest of the yard, as if the fence and bushes had woven a little cocoon. The world beyond felt a few steps further away. We sat down, not quite cross-legged, more like the way you sit when you're not sure how long you'll be staying. The sun warmed the tops of our shoulders. "I've been talking to someone," he said after a moment, eyes on the patch of dirt between his sneakers. "Not someone you know." I already knew who he meant. Not the name, but the role. The calm, measured voice that wasn't family. "A counselor?" I asked gently. He nodded. "Online. At first I thought it was stupid. Like I'm fine, I can handle things. But the more stuff piled up, work, money, the whole pressure of what now with my life, the more I realized I really can't." He gave a humorless little laugh. "Or at least, I don't want to anymore." I swallowed, letting his words sink in. "I heard you," I admitted softly. "Last night. I didn't mean to. I was just walking by. You sounded different." He didn't stiffen or snap. He just nodded.
"Yeah."
Different is a word for it. "Why didn't you tell anyone you were talking to someone?" I asked. "Mom, Dad, me." He plucked a leaf from the ground, tore it in two, then in two again. "I didn't want everyone worrying, or treating me like I was suddenly breakable glass. And," he hesitated, "I felt kind of ashamed, I guess, like I was failing at life because I needed help." "Do you still think that?" I asked. He looked up, met my gaze straight on. "No," he said. "Not so much now. Feels more like choosing not to drown alone." His honesty pulled at something inside me. I'd spent so long seeing him as my personal superhero that it hadn't occurred to me that superheroes get exhausted too. We sat there for a while, not filling every gap with words. A bird chirped somewhere above us. A car drove by on the main road, distant and unimportant. "I'm glad you're getting help," I said eventually. "That you found somewhere to talk where you don't have to pretend." His shoulders dropped a fraction, tension easing. "Me too," he said. "And I'm glad you know. Makes it easier to breathe, I guess." We didn't suddenly pour out our deepest fears or hug and cry like a movie. We just talked. About little things. About the weird kids at my school. About his coworker who always microwaved fish. About how he regretted not joining that photography club in college. Underneath it all, there was this quiet, new thread tying us together, the knowledge that we were both allowed to be human in front of each other. When we finally went back inside, the hallway felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something in our relationship had expanded. That night, lying in bed, I opened my notebook, the same one I doodled in, scribbled song lyrics in, and I wrote down what had happened. Not the exact words, but the feeling of being invited into that hidden corner of the yard, and into that hidden corner of his life. I realized that by seeing his vulnerability, I'd stumbled into awareness of my own, of how often I swallowed my anxieties so I wouldn't bother anyone, of how I assumed everyone older than me had it figured out. There was a kind of closeness that comes not from shared jokes alone, but from shared truths. Later that night, I heard the front door again. Ethan came home from his evening shift. I stayed at my desk, pen still in hand, when his knuckles tapped lightly on my door frame. "You still up?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, looking up. "Just thinking." "Why?" He smiled, stepped inside, leaned against the wall. "Thinking about what?" "Today," I said honestly. "About you. About me. About how weird and good it is to actually talk." He nodded. "Same." There was a rhythm to our conversation now, spaces where silence was allowed, where neither of us scrambled to fill it. For the next hour, we just existed together. Talked about nothing important, and yet everything about it felt important. We argued over which cereal was objectively superior. We laughed about the time I'd cut my own bangs in 5th grade. We remembered the night our power went out and we camped in the living room with flashlights and blankets. Beneath it, something steady had changed, the understanding that we'd crossed from surface siblings into something deeper. When I finally slipped under my covers, I felt a kind of calm I hadn't expected. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, or because his problems were fixed, but because we'd stopped pretending they didn't exist. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams. Ethan moved around downstairs. I could hear cabinets opening, the echo of a spoon clinking against a mug. For the first time, when I heard his footsteps, I didn't feel like I was just the younger sister following in the wake of someone who had it all together. I felt like someone he could lean on too. From then on, I paid attention differently. I noticed the days when his jokes were a little too sharp, the mornings when he massaged his temples before coffee, and instead of brushing it all aside as, "That's just Ethan," I occasionally asked, "Rough day?" or simply said, "Want to sit outside for a bit?" Sometimes he'd say no. Sometimes he'd shrug and say, "Yeah, actually." Either way, I'd learned that being there wasn't about having the right words. It was about being willing to sit in the quiet with him. Looking back now, I see that night I overheard him talking as a turning point. Not because of what was said behind that closed door, but because of what I chose to do with that knowledge. I could have turned it into gossip. I could have weaponized it in some argument later. Instead, I let it be an open door, an invitation into deeper understanding. And in walking through that door, I didn't just learn more about my brother. I discovered something about myself, that listening, really listening, is its own kind of love. That noticing the small changes in someone can be as important as being there for the big ones. That strength and softness can live in the same person, whether that person is your older brother or yourself. I'll never forget that dim slice of light under his door, or the hidden corner of the yard, or the way the sun felt on our shoulders that afternoon we sat there and didn't pretend anymore. Sometimes the most important discoveries in life don't come from scandals or secrets. They come from paying attention to the quiet moments, from hearing the tremor in someone's voice, from meeting them where they are and saying, without needing exact words, "I see you. I'm here." That's what happened between me and Ethan. And from that day on, our ordinary house felt a little warmer, our conversations a little deeper, and my understanding of him, of myself, of what it really means to love someone, grew in ways I'm still grateful for.